Yulia turned to look at me as she reached the door. "Thanks, Braden. See you tomorrow." "Of course," I replied. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed me softly on the cheek. Her fragrance lingered for a moment. As she turned and walked down the hallway, I watched her move gracefully toward the elevator. She was a young and beautiful woman, there was no denying that. She glanced back and gave me a small wave before disappearing. The moment I closed the door to my apartment, a voice broke the silence. "A little young for you, don't you think?" I froze, staring at the back of the door, wishing for a moment that there was a mirror so I could see my own expression. I waited, but no follow-up came. Maybe it was finally over. Maybe she had finally moved on. I turned around, trying to muster anger, but it wasn't there. "Well, she is young, Melanie," I said. Not sure about the rest. I walked past her without bothering to look at her again. Entering the living area, I felt an abrupt need for something to drink. I opened the fridge for a quick inventory: fruits, vegetables, the chicken breast thawing for dinner. Suddenly, cooking didn't appeal anymore. There was yogurt, milk, energy drinks, and beer. I grabbed a single bottle, one of the 7 left from the pack I'd bought almost a month ago. It was a far cry from the pace I'd kept up during the first year after my divorce. The click of her heels followed me as she walked, contrasting sharply with the quiet shuffle of my bare feet. I opened the bottle and placed it on the sleek stainless steel counter. Tossing the cap into the trash bin, I surveyed the kitchen. Everything was in its place, neat, organized, spotless. I crossed the invisible line dividing the open-plan spaces: kitchen, dining area, office, bedroom, gym, and living room. The furniture was top quality, though mismatched, each piece chosen because it resonated with me. Everything had a story. Everything was me. And somehow, it all fit together. Except for her, she didn't even bother to offer me a drink, though she had just appeared unannounced. It was the first time I'd seen her in 8 years. I was honest enough to admit she looked good, beautiful, even, but that had always been the case. It was her other qualities that had caused problems. "I hope you don't think your presence here is welcome," I said flatly. "You're not my guest. If you want something, help yourself." I watched her turn on her heels and head back to the kitchen. Her sharp movements, as always, were calculated. She hadn't changed much. She still wore skirts that silently proclaimed, "Yes, I know you're looking." I couldn't help but notice the toned lines of her legs and the delicate straps of her expensive heels. My gaze lingered momentarily, but I pulled my thoughts back before they strayed further. The usual pang of longing didn't come, the one that reminded me of the pain and heartbreak of losing something that was once mine. Instead, what I felt surprised me: pride. Yes, a quiet acknowledgement of my past mistakes, but pride nonetheless. With her signature wine glass in hand, Melanie's eyes were calm, coldly concealing her true intentions. For the first time that I could recall, this realization didn't scare me. "You look good, Braden," she said. "I feel good, Melanie." The chess match had begun, and for once, I didn't feel defensive right from the start. "Aren't you even going to ask why I'm here?" "Not even a little curious?" "It's not that I'm not curious. One can never have too much information," I replied, watching her malicious smile, clearly thinking we were on equal footing. "I just don't care." Even in the most unexpected situations, Melanie had an uncanny ability to keep her expression unreadable, a fact I knew all too well. So when I caught a fleeting grimace of pain cross her face, even if just for a second, it felt like a small victory. She turned toward my wall, a full 18 feet of framed photographs documenting my travels. A floor-to-ceiling reminder of how far I'd come and the lessons I'd learned along the way. "That's what you call grounding," I'd heard someone mention it once. Surely, I'd never truly felt it. But that's where I began, right after Melanie divorced me and dismantled my life. That I won't lie and say our marriage was perfect, it wasn't. We argued often in the beginning, mostly because we didn't have more than a few spare dollars between us at any given time. But we were young, hopeful, impulsive, and committed. Our marriage didn't fail early because we never thought it could. After all, soulmates never give up. So, memories were created. Moments like digging through the couch cushions to scrape together enough for a shared fast food meal, and still managing to split a cupcake for our first anniversary. Or making our first Christmas ornaments from paper and crayons, hanging them on a second-hand tree we found behind our apartment. By our second Christmas, Melanie had laminated those ornaments. I loved her more every year we placed them on the tree. Still, even when you love someone, they can get on your nerves. Melanie had a habit of rearranging things, moving utensils in the kitchen, spices on the shelf, or everything in the hallway closet into a pattern that made sense only to her. Just when I'd get used to the new setup, she'd change it again. It was a small thing, but it became frustrating. "Where are the scissors?" I'd ask. "In a drawer somewhere," she'd reply. "They're not where they were last week." "Did you move them?" "Probably. I can't remember." "Just keep looking, they're here somewhere." I'd often have to buy replacements for things I couldn't find if I needed them urgently. Weeks would sometimes pass before the missing items resurfaced, which was a problem since we were broke, and any extra expense was significant. Yes, it was annoying, but we made do. Money wasn't always on my mind, probably because of how close we were. We were young and full of passion, finding time for each other whenever and wherever we could. Those moments were special, but they were just that, moments. After the dust settled from our divorce, and I put the lid back on the bottle of memories, I had my first real epiphany. Those difficult years, when we never knew where next month's rent would come from, taught me that together, we could survive even the worst situations. For Melanie, however, they were a nightmare she vowed never to repeat, no matter the cost. I watched her as she scanned my collection. Her eyes gave her away, lingering on the photographs of places we had once dreamed of visiting together, dreams that were impossible but shared. She was the embodiment of restless movement, the wine in her glass swaying with the rhythm of her steps. Her blonde, shoulder-length hair fell over the silk blouse she wore, revealing the soft, delicate lines of her neck. The same neck I had once, in my darkest moments, imagined wanting to throttle out of frustration. "I suppose it's true, you really did visit all those places," she said. I did. She was watching me again, as though trying to predict my next move. Unfortunately for her, I didn't have one. "You've changed," she said. "Oh, I doubt that's true. In fact, I know it isn't. I'm still the same man I've always been, maybe with a bit more of me, and a lot less of you." "You see what I mean?" she said, a faint smirk forming. "You never would have said things like that before. Life is full of things we want to say, plan to say, and dream of saying. But when we stay silent, we lose ourselves in that silence, or we lose the person we're meant to be. We pretend to be someone we're not." I spent a long time searching for that answer. Eventually, I decided, we try to be the person we think we are until someone holds up a mirror, and we can't sustain the lie anymore. Some people handle that shocking truth better than others. That mocking smile of hers had returned. She thought she was winning. I knew better. "So, what's different now?" she asked. "There's nothing left of me for you to take. We're no longer connected in any way. And that means you can't hurt me anymore." She started to speak, her voice catching in her throat. For a moment, I wanted to believe she was moved, but I wasn't fooled, not even a little. "I want you to stop it," she said. "I didn't start this, but you could end it." "I'm not sure that's true. And even if it were, I'm not sure I would." "Do you enjoy this?" "Not particularly. I have very little interest in being constantly reminded that the person I once loved most in the world was a liar and a cheat." I wasn't sure why, but this time, my words seemed to sting more than they had before, even if only a little. And besides, I added, I'm smarter now. Never interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. Napoleon had said that. This time, I wouldn't be caught off guard by the devastation she had once unleashed during our first major conflict. Back then, I wasn't prepared. This time, I was ready, or so I thought. The rumors had started months earlier. People whispered wherever I went. The economy was collapsing, and any job was worth its weight in gold. Layoffs were around every corner. Walking through the factory floor was already tense, with eyes following my every move. People would stop me when they thought no one was watching, asking if I had seen the list. At home, things were worse. Melanie was bordering on panic, asking me every day if I had heard anything, if I still had my job, and what my plan was. What were we going to do? I didn't have a plan. I didn't think I needed one. My boss was a good man. He looked me in the eye and told me not to worry. So, I didn't. I trusted him. Things would have been fine if he'd had the final say, if others hadn't intervened. Were there signs I missed? Probably. There were possibilities I only recognized when it was too late. Our life had taken a clear downturn. I thought it was stress. I knew she wasn't in the mood as often as before. I suppose I thought it was more my fault than hers. Then there was the fact that Melanie already knew what had happened before I even stepped inside the house. I had been laid off. My boss had been stunned as he informed me that the man with the highest production output and best quality ratings was being let go. Melanie didn't even seem surprised. Unfortunately, that wouldn't be the only long-term commitment about to fall apart. She gave me no indication that our marriage was in trouble. She went through the motions of being a devoted wife effortlessly, loving hugs, kisses on the cheek, keeping me well fed, and maintaining an immaculate home. In those last few weeks, she was the picture of a perfect homemaker. She never let me leave the room without telling me she loved me, probably to mask her guilt. I was served papers while standing in line at a company-sponsored relocation resource center. When I returned home, I found the locks changed, my clothes packed and left at the door, with another copy of the restraining order neatly placed on top. My severance package should have lasted for months, but almost immediately, I was forced to choose between using my remaining funds to fight for custody of my daughter or to keep myself afloat. I chose to fight. But I was outmatched. Lawyers, psychologists, and judges all reached the same conclusion: I was an unfit father. I was unemployed and had no means to care for a child. It was all there in writing, legal, official, damning. The final blow came when I had one last desperate idea. If I could talk to April face to face, she would listen. At 9 years old, she was old enough to say she loved her dad, that she wanted to see me, and that we were inseparable. So, I waited in the shadows behind some bushes, watching what used to be my home. That's when I saw them, my wife, my daughter, and the vice president of operations from my former company. He was the son of the founder, a notorious womanizer, a selfish jerk, and possibly the worst business executive ever. But his father was respected, people were loyal to the family, and the only ruined life was mine. I was a nobody, everyone said so. He was a man about 10 years older than me, with a growing waistline, a fat checkbook, and a pre-made family. Admittedly, my hatred colored my description. He wasn't disfigured or anything, but all I could see was ugliness. That was the night I took my first drink, not the first in my life, but the first one I took to numb my pain. It was a long drink. It lasted a year. It could have lasted forever, but then I saw her again. I was wandering the streets with an unkempt beard, wearing unwashed clothes, and carrying a stench that announced my presence long before I arrived. I was only weeks away from being homeless, if my rundown apartment in a nearly condemned pre-war building could even be called a home. She was coming out of one of the downtown boutiques, her arms full of heavy shopping bags, rummaging through her designer purse for the keys to her luxury SUV. I startled her, of that, I'm sure. For a moment, she didn't know what to do next, protect her belongings or protect herself. The alcoholic haze that shielded me from the real world ensured I wasn't a danger. On my part, it took far too long to recognize her. "Oh, my God," she said, her hands covering her mouth in shock, before she jumped into her car and sped away. It registered only minutes later. A few minutes after that, I stole a bottle of beer from a convenience store. That's why I had been searching for a bottle opener. I was too drunk to realize the bottle had a twist-off cap, and Melanie had long since rearranged the kitchen utensils for no apparent reason. I couldn't find the bottle opener. After the bottle broke and the contents of every drawer but one ended up on the floor, I finally found it. There was no magic in that moment. It wasn't our home anymore. The bottle opener was exactly where I had left it, where it had always been. Everything was in its place. That day, I stopped drinking. The next day, I left my hometown with a backpack full of my belongings and barely 50 pesos in my pocket. It wasn't hard to leave. I wasn't an alcoholic, I was a broken man trying to find solace in a bottle, and failing. "Everything with you turns into some kind of inspirational quote now," she said. "Not always," I replied. "Not everything is meant to inspire someone. Sometimes, things are just reminders of where we've been." "What does that even mean, Braden? What does it mean to you?" "I have no idea what it means to you, and frankly, I'm not interested in explaining what anything means to me, especially not to you. I wandered for 18 months the first time, walking, hitchhiking, and occasionally taking a bus. I worked odd jobs until I had just enough money to move on. Money was scarce, but my eyes were open. I camped wherever I found myself. There was always a place to rest, take a shower, or find a meal. That I indulged in anything that caught my interest in second-hand bookstores, where I could buy a dozen books for the price of a movie ticket. I read voraciously and wrote everything I wanted to remember, everything I felt, in an old, worn spiral notebook. It became a journal of pain and discovery. I kept up with world events by reading newspapers that others had discarded. Often, they were outdated, but the news on those pages didn't affect me much anyway. I also spoke to people. Well, mostly I listened. People love to talk, and I was a good listener. Once, I splurged on a very used digital camera from a pawn shop. I took photos to remember the places I visited, the people I met, and, later in my journey, the things that inspired me. About once a month, for around 5 pesos and a few cents, chain stores would transfer all my photos from my memory card to a CD. After a year and a half, I settled in a small, dusty town in the middle of the country. I got my first full-time job since the divorce, working in a fertilizer factory warehouse. During the day, I worked hard loading supplies, and at night, I returned to my rented room above the local garage to read and write. I upgraded from my notebook to a second-hand laptop and spent my free days at the local library using their free internet to upload my thoughts and photos to a blog. People followed me, left comments, mostly anonymous, and though writing started as a cathartic alternative to therapy, I enjoyed knowing that people were interested in what I had to say. I enjoyed it a lot. Melanie stopped at the only photo I had kept from my old collection. It was taken at an amusement park. April was 4 years old then, her ponytail tied with pink ribbons, and her freshly pierced ears sparkling with faux diamond earrings. The flash was too bright but couldn't outshine the smiles on the faces of the 3 people in the picture. Each expression captured the moment perfectly: first, surprise, then, silliness, and finally, genuine laughter. "I could help you reconnect with her," Melanie said. "Oh, so you're up to date on your daughter's latest happenings?" I asked, watching her try to read my expression for clues. It must have been difficult for her not to have the upper hand, not to be one step ahead, wondering what I knew or didn't know. "You should be proud. She's become just like you," I said. I saw the shock in her eyes at that comment, along with something else, perhaps regret. She paused to look at the photo again. I think she was surprised that the images didn't align with her memories, or maybe with what she had been told. It's hard to say for sure, because she didn't comment. I never considered myself a writer in my previous life. I was a production supervisor at a large manufacturing company. That was my title after my 4th promotion. I had started at the bottom and worked my way up. Writing was never part of my dreams. I never imagined myself as a writer, but that didn't stop an online men's magazine from including my blog in its list of the best on the web. It didn't stop them from offering me a column, first monthly, then weekly. The pay wasn't much, but it opened doors. 2 years later, I received an email from a publisher. It was completely unexpected. They wanted to see more of my work. They wanted to publish my book, a book that, at the time, didn't even exist. I sent them a loosely connected collection of essays, and they sent me an editor who asked me to write an introductory chapter about how my journey began. For the first time, I shared my story with an editor. And then, nothing. At least not for a few years. I assumed my work wasn't good enough. But I kept writing my blog. My column gained popularity, the pay improved a little, but I grew restless. So I left again. This time, I went to Europe. There are no hostels for 35-year-old men, no discounted train tickets, but I still crossed the continent as economically as possible. I saw things I had only read about in textbooks or seen on television. I visited places where history and traditions were born. And I didn't stop in Europe. I ventured into the Middle East, then to India, spending 3 months in Asia. The languages, the cultures, the food, it was all a new experience for me. I saw what true poverty looked like, not the petty excuses I had once cursed. And yet, people were the same everywhere. People liked to talk that I spent 14 months on that journey and was more than ready to return to the United States when I received another email. Attached was a preview cover of my book. That's when things got interesting. I returned home to a whirlwind of agents, editors, publicists, and lawyers. With the growing popularity of my column, there was a buzz about my book. I leveraged that buzz into a significant raise from the magazine, primarily based on a complicated formula tied to ad revenue. It was more than I'd ever made before, and more than enough for me. So, I returned to my hometown to start a new life in the place I had come to love and miss deeply. Unfortunately, my book was met with an average reception, far from what some had anticipated. I wasn't particularly surprised. My loyal blog and column followers probably accounted for 99% of the sales. Mediocre sales meant my career as an author likely ended before it began. Then he went on television and called my first chapter a series of lies. A local reporter from my hometown asked the questions: was the story in my book true? Had I really lost my job, my wife, and my daughter because of him? Had I perpetuated lies in court, he could have kept quiet. He should have kept quiet. But he didn't. In most of the civilized world, the story didn't even cause a ripple. But in my hometown, the son of a wealthy businessman and the ex-wife of a struggling author made for juicy gossip. Whether out of arrogance or shame, he overstepped. He sued me for defamation and damage to his reputation. That was all the publisher needed. They had spent time and money verifying my book and even more on editing, design, production, and distribution. So when they saw an opportunity to recoup their investment, they jumped on it. They unleashed an army of expensive lawyers and PR professionals on my former employer. From a distance, it wasn't about him and me anymore, it was about the controversy and the free publicity that came with it. His actions caused quite a stir, and my book shot up the bestseller lists. Funny how life works. Some people just never learn when to quit while they're ahead. Did you know the board asked for his resignation? She asked. No, I replied. I hadn't heard that, I said. Honestly, I'm surprised he lasted as long as he did. Productivity dropped 21% after his brilliant budget cuts in the first year and another 18% the following year. Sales were down, and morale was at rock bottom. Your husband was never good at managing things. I wasn't surprised that she didn't jump to his defense. She would never have taken a bullet for me. Why do I think you already knew that? I asked. Because you're a cold, calculating, and ruthless woman. It's a shame, really. Though, according to the papers I just signed for Yulia, I think you're going to need that paycheck. Yulia is your lawyer, she asked. She's not mine, and she's not a lawyer. She's a paralegal who works for the firm representing my publisher. I've been trying to tell you, this isn't about me, though it seems I'm going to benefit quite a lot. I guess karma is real. I could see the flurry of responses in her eyes, all the things she wanted to say but knew she couldn't. I watched as she finally concluded that she had no cards left to play, no advantage to leverage. I had hoped she would give me the chance to deliver a few of the clever comebacks I had been saving, but at the same time, I wished she would just leave me in peace. So, why are you here? I asked, catching her off guard. She recovered quickly. Oh, now you're curious. No. I just don't understand what you think you can accomplish. I suppose he should be grateful you love him enough to be here, trying to salvage what's left of his crumbling empire. But, as I said, it's really not up to me. Her reaction was exactly what I expected, but I pressed on. You don't love him, though, do you? You love his money. Oh, the irony, he had it, but now, in the cruelest twist of fate, you have to give it to me. And once again, you're left with nothing. What, don't think you can find another rich man to bankroll you? I think you're underestimating yourself. You'll land on your feet, or, in your case, probably on your back. I couldn't help but laugh. I wasn't sure I'd ever laughed so hard in my life. She couldn't possibly believe she was different, but her defensive posture and the look in her eyes told me otherwise. Then, something struck me. Could it be that she didn't know? Was that possible? Oh my God, I said. You don't know. What's that supposed to mean? She asked, her voice faltering. I didn't answer right away, quickly running through the mental calculations. There wasn't any catch. After months of interviews, depositions, and uncovered emotions, everything was already on record. If she truly didn't know, he had to know she would find out soon. I wouldn't be harming the case by telling her something that was about to become public knowledge. You're right, it wasn't what you thought at all, I said. It was all perfectly innocent, wasn't it? Yes, she whispered, almost inaudibly. I considered asking her to repeat herself, but I didn't. He was simply reaching out to the families of his employees, I continued, making sure everyone was aware of the situation at the plant, ensuring they were prepared for the worst-case scenario. Of course, he paid special attention to the most vulnerable group, middle management. We were the ones most at risk, and he felt his personal attention was necessary. She listened, but she clearly had no idea what I was leading to. So, he invited you to lunch to give you a heads up? I asked. Of course, she said. Nothing had been decided yet. Everything was still preliminary. And then he started calling you, giving you insider information about how the evaluation process was going. Then there were more casual lunches, more calls, and eventually, he changed tactics. He opened up to you completely. The stress of having so many lives hanging on his decisions was just too much. The things he offered to save people's jobs were shocking, weren't they? Money, favors. Her eyes were wide, wider than I had ever seen them. I walked to my desk as I spoke, searching for the right file. When I found it, I continued. And that's when you sealed our fate, I said. That was the moment he won, and I lost. The moment your trust in me, as a man, as a father, as a husband, as a provider, gave way to your greed was the moment you gave him your body and destroyed my world. I ran my fingers over the documents on the table, their edges crisp under my touch. I had never really believed in the lists. I always assumed their existence was a myth. But the lawyers from my publisher had combed through thousands of documents unearthed during the discovery process. The first list wasn't particularly interesting, except that my name was at the top of the to retain section. Based on the dates, it must have been one of the earliest drafts, perhaps even the very first. The second list, however, was far more intriguing. The names were mostly the same, but this version had nearly illegible annotations from John Davis. Several names were marked, including mine, but my name, and one other, had a single red line drawn through them. Next to my name was the word Melanie. Only one other name had been marked in a similar way. The lawyers couldn't believe he had kept it. Then again, he had always been a fool. The third list, printed on his personal letterhead and labeled Final, no longer included my name at all. Her eyes darted back and forth across the pages, likely trying to piece together an answer she wouldn't want to believe. "You're probably wondering," I said, "how I know all this." She stared at me, her mouth slightly open. The look of surprise didn't suit her. "You figured it out. You're not stupid, Melanie." "Not entirely. You know what I mean." The urge to pour myself a drink was strong, so I got up from my chair and walked to the kitchen. I dropped a few ice cubes into a glass and filled it with filtered water from the fridge. If I had learned anything, it was never to give in to impulses. Decisions made after careful planning and analysis of possible outcomes were always more pragmatic. Besides, being drunk in the same room as Melanie felt like asking for trouble. "I believe," I said, quoting Steve Martin, "that making love is one of the most beautiful, natural, and healthy things money can buy." I turned back to her. "Since we're airing everything out, I have to ask, did you ever love me, Melanie?" She had been staring at the documents for about 20 minutes. By the 5th minute, I noticed her fists clenching, her hands trembling. A few minutes later, her impassive expression returned. She hadn't said another word during that time, so I decided to break the silence. Apparently, she wasn't interested in answering my question. She tilted her head just enough to meet my gaze before quickly looking away. That I might have focused more on Melanie, but I simply couldn't understand why she was sitting in my living room. I had questions and wanted answers, but her sudden appearance didn't make sense. It hadn't even been a few hours since Mr. Moneybags' lawyers had requested a settlement conference. My attorney and the publisher's legal team had thrown an impromptu celebration that evening. Seeing that move from them was practically an admission of defeat. But in a world ruled by sharks, these guys were killer whales. They didn't back down from a fight, they sought it out and relished the chance to humiliate their opponents. I was sure none of them had read my book. Everything I had written went against the values they upheld, and yet, it felt good to have them on my side. Having been on the other side of the table, armed only with my sense of righteousness and being summarily crushed, wasn't an experience I cared to repeat. Yes, I could easily have been called a hypocrite, and rightly so. But I hadn't started out this way, so I happily let myself enjoy the moment. Lost in those thoughts, I looked back at Melanie. She was still as beautiful as ever. I smiled at the thought that I had always been right. I had often told her she would only become more attractive with time. Honestly, I had no idea why she had dressed up so much for me. She looked ready for a night on the town, or more accurately, a night at home. And then it hit me. Good God, he sent you here. I wasn't sure I had ever seen Melanie so angry. In fact, I wasn't sure I had seen her angry at all when we were married. Even during our worst arguments, she had never been truly angry. Disappointed? Certainly. Annoyed? Absolutely. Afraid? More than I had ever realized. That fear was why her betrayal had been so devastating. In an ocean of improbable outcomes, with waves of doubts crashing in my mind, the idea of Melanie abandoning me had always felt a continent away. Even now, after years of self-reflection and disciplined effort to rebuild my confidence, I knew I would never be the same. Soulmates aren't supposed to leave each other. But mine did. He must have been desperate. The lawsuits and attorney fees totaled $12 million. He was wealthy, yes, but not that wealthy. The lawyers estimated the judge would likely award nearly $7 million in damages. They had tried to explain the calculations to me once. My book was considered intellectual property, and it had been appraised. His lawsuit had been deemed frivolous and baseless, and they had amassed a mountain of evidence to prove he and his lawyer knew that all along that it all sounded like a game where the person who could shout the loudest nonsense would win. Even so, the judgment wouldn't leave him bankrupt, but it would come close. Without a steady income or the cushy position he had once enjoyed, the result would be devastating. Sending Melanie to me in a last-ditch effort to save the only thing he truly cared about, his money, was the only thing that made sense. He needed a wife and family. Melanie looked up but still didn't respond. I was certain she had no idea what I was talking about. I had to admire his ability to keep her in the dark. I'd never been able to hide even the smallest secret from her. Guilt would have consumed me. I guess a conscience wasn't something John Davis worried about. Some members of the board had started asking him questions. Why didn't he have a family? When would he stop with the endless list of women and parties? Not that they cared about his personal life, but it could become a problem for the company. You can't have your next CEO wrapped up in a scandal. It's bad for business. He had reportedly asked Stephanie Carmichael to marry him outright, for money, of course. She had been with him for the money, so he probably assumed she would just agree. Stephanie was what most people would call a 304, or at least that was the rumor around the plant. Her husband, David, was what I would call a jerk. I didn't have first-hand knowledge of their antics, but I'd heard the stories. Most of the time, rumors are just that, rumors. But in their case, I always believed them. Stephanie Carmichael was the kind of woman who showed a little too much skin, wore outfits that bordered on inappropriate, and said things that could easily be interpreted in very different ways. Her husband was the type to boast about her, trying to get the guys to admit they were looking at her. I'd always thought she was quite attractive, for someone with her reputation, of course. Her resume, as people called it, might have been just rumors as well. Still, stories that would have been laughable about anyone else seemed plausible for them, tales of one-night stands, wild house parties, photos, and videos on the internet. I had no idea if any of it was true. But I did know one thing for certain: David Carmichael was the other name crossed out on the infamous list, with Stephanie's name written right next to it. David had mysteriously disappeared almost immediately after his dismissal. Although I had always thought Stephanie was just a clueless blonde, apparently, she wasn't as naive as she seemed. She had kept tax records of gifts to prove it, 3 years' worth. He had given her nearly $50,000 for her treatments twice a week. Steffi, the name she seemed to prefer, had exposed Davis's little seduction plan. She made it clear she had no qualms about exchanging favors for money. We had an agreement, she explained. He was generous with his gifts, and I showed my gratitude in the best way possible, every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon in the apartment he rented for me. My husband and I enjoyed his generosity, but as soon as my David finished nursing school and came back home, I left that fat fool and his tiny tools. Stephanie also had no problem offering a detailed and convincing explanation of why Davis continued to seek a little fun on the side, even years after marrying Melanie. I looked directly at Melanie as I finished my next sentence. Apparently, he was looking for something he couldn't get at home. You know, like certain favors. I wasn't sure if Stephanie had been telling the truth until I saw the look in Melanie's eyes. That was when I knew for sure. Of course, I added, she could be making it up, because that definitely doesn't sound like the woman I married. I could see Melanie was on the verge of losing control. Nearly an hour had passed since she'd made any sound at all. I decided that if I was ever going to get my proverbial pound of flesh, it had to be now. What did he tell you when he sent you here? I asked. He told me to stop you. To stop the lawsuits, by any means necessary. Does he prostitute you often, I asked, or just when he's about to lose his fortune? He's not my pimp. He's my husband. Hey, I'm not here to judge. I know firsthand what that tight little body of yours can do to a man. It makes you believe things that aren't even remotely true. I leaned back in my chair. So, when are we moving on to the, by any means necessary, part of the show? Because, honestly, the persuasive argument segment has become a bit tedious. What's it going to take? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The lack of conviction in her tone was striking. It was the only moment I allowed myself to feel even a flicker of pity for her. It was simply beyond my comprehension, how someone so beautiful, so full of life, so energetic, could have such little self-respect. How could she allow herself to be used this way for money? I could understand the temptation, at least a little. When we had furnished our first apartment, my favorite chair had cost us over $1,000. I wasn't sure Melanie and I had spent that much on everything else we owned combined. Sure, it was extravagant, but it was also comfortable. Still, there was no doubt in my mind that I would trade every single indulgence for just one more day alone with Melanie in that old, humble apartment. To have things be the way they were before that, I guess that's what made us different. As I said before, I continued, even if I could stop this, I wouldn't. I think you should go home to your husband and tell him I wasn't even interested in his offer. Take your desperation back to him. Reunite, and talk about how you're going to get through this difficult time together. I'm sure that with a love as strong as yours, you'll find a way. I watched her. I watched her perfect lips, the ones I wanted to kiss. It took everything in me not to reach for her, not to make love to her. After all, soulmates never give up on each other. That I waited for the tear, but it never came. Oh, sure, her eyes filled with water, and for a moment, I thought she might let it spill over. But she didn't. I had to give her credit for that, at least. Get out of my house. They say making love without love is an empty experience. But as far as empty experiences go, it's not the worst. Our conversation had lasted a couple of hours, but I hadn't planned on being with her that night. To be honest, I hadn't thought about it much at all. Too many other thoughts had been swirling in my mind. The weeks leading up to that night had been full of surprises, but she was beautiful, and I was a man. And if she accepted? What does a girl have to do to get her glass refilled around here? She asked. I took her glass, went into the kitchen, and filled it with her preferred wine. I returned with her glass and the bottle. I read your book, twice, she said. I might have responded with a clever comment or a sincere, thank you, if I hadn't been distracted by the scene in front of me. I might have found my words if I hadn't been wondering what had happened to her blouse. I felt a little regret for missing whatever act of misdirection had made it disappear. They say exploration makes you better at love, she teased. Well, I suppose that makes me quite impressive, I replied. Oh, I have no doubt, she said. We made love. Jesus Christ, Braden, your ex was an idiot, Yulia said later. Oh, Yulia, you say the sweetest things, I replied. They say the best revenge is living well and proving yourself. Yulia stayed with me every night for the next 4 months as the court battles dragged on. We made love like newlyweds throughout her stay, although she always made it clear that, no matter how spectacular it was, she would return to New York as soon as the litigation was over. I held no grudge about that. Perhaps sharks don't stay in the shallow end of the pool, even if they've just completed their law degrees. Still, the time I spent with her, however brief, was incredible. That first night, she had been in my apartment, explaining the latest legal development, this time, the case involving my daughter suing me to secure her inheritance. I can't credibly claim that I didn't know Melanie was furious when she left that night. She was clearly upset, maybe even livid. But I honestly thought she was angry with me. Perhaps for rejecting her or for taking something she felt she had rightfully earned through her efforts. Apparently, I was wrong that I can't imagine what he must have felt. I know I was devastated when Melanie chose him over me for something as mundane as a corporate restructuring. But then again, the coroner's report was inconclusive. John Davis may never have known. Hours after leaving me, drunk enough to barely stay conscious, Melanie shot him once and then turned the gun on herself. They said she likely died instantly, but no one could say for certain whether she lived long enough to realize she would rather destroy herself than make love to him while poor. That I can't imagine what that must have felt like, but I hope she at least had a moment to reflect that I spent days angry, not for myself, but for her daughter. As troubled as Melanie was, her daughter still needed her. April had never given me any indication that she and Melanie were close. In fact, it was probably quite the opposite. Still, she was a lost girl. When she came to see me once, she didn't remember me, not the real me, at least. That surprised me. I thought she would be old enough to recall something. But memories can be replaced by lies if those lies are repeated enough. Clearly, she didn't believe me when I told her that, once upon a time, we had been happy together as a family. And now, there was no one left who could confirm it. A single photo on a wall filled with hundreds wasn't enough to change her opinion. She was resentful at Melanie's funeral, which I understood. Unfortunately, months later, I was still her #1 enemy, with no hope of changing her mind. When the court ruling finally came down and she lost nearly all of her inheritance, she stormed out of the courtroom, barely avoiding contempt charges for the stream of profanities she hurled on her way out. That was the last time I saw her, and I have little hope of seeing her again. The bond one had hoped we would always share seemed as fragile as the one between her mother and me. But perhaps fathers and daughters are different. Maybe Mr. and Mrs. John Davis hadn't poisoned her permanently against me. Maybe, one day, she'll know she can always count on her dad to help her. Or maybe she'll find her own way in the wide world. Perhaps she'll find her soulmate, hopefully, someone who won't abandon her.